In the autumn of 1876, railroad workers laying tracks through the remote hills of southwestern Missouri stumbled upon a discovery that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Beneath the charred foundation of a long-burned farmhouse, they uncovered 17 human skeletons arranged with eerie precision. Each was missing certain bones, femurs, ribs, even skulls meticulously removed with surgical exactness. But what made this revelation truly horrifying wasn't just the methodical burials or the faint saw marks etched into the remaining bones. It was the brass medical instruments and a leather-bound journal found alongside them chronicling 3 years of experiments the author described as therapeutic anthropy, the medicinal consumption of human flesh. The Missouri State Medical Board immediately sealed all records, and the local sheriff received instructions from Jefferson City to classify the case as a catastrophic fire with multiple casualties. For nearly 50 years, the truth about Dr. Cornelius Endecott's private medical facility lay as buried as the victims themselves. But tonight, thanks to recently discovered correspondence and survivor testimonies miraculously preserved, we can finally reveal the chilling reality of what happened at Endecott Farm. Before we dive further into the story of Dr. Cornelius Endecott and his macabre medical practice, I'm curious, where are you listening from tonight? Drop a comment with your city or state. And make sure to subscribe so you never miss these dark hidden tales from America's past. The discovery of those 17 skeletons was only the beginning. A story that would challenge everything people thought they knew about post-Civil War medicine and the desperate measures some were willing to take to heal the wounds of America's bloodiest conflict. By 1873, the hills of southwestern Missouri still bore the scars of a war that had ended 8 years earlier. This region, caught between Confederate sympathies and Union occupation, had witnessed some of the most brutal guerrilla warfare of the conflict. Towns like Carthage and Joplin were slowly rebuilding, but the countryside remained scattered with abandoned homesteads and men carrying invisible wounds that conventional medicine could not touch. Into this shattered landscape arrived Dr. Cornelius Endecott, armed with impeccable credentials and revolutionary promises. A graduate of Harvard Medical School in 1851, he had served as a field surgeon with the 14th Massachusetts Infantry, witnessing amputations, battlefield trauma, and the primitive medical practices that left more soldiers dead from infection than enemy bullets. Though his service earned commendations, those who knew him noticed a disturbing change in his demeanor. After the Battle of Antietam, where he labored 3 straight days in a makeshift field hospital that resembled a charred warehouse more than a place of healing. After the war, Endecott spent 2 years in Europe, claiming to study advanced surgical techniques in Vienna and Berlin. Letters home preserved at the Massachusetts Historical Society brimmed with enthusiasm for revolutionary treatments for what physicians were beginning to recognize as soldier's heart, what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD). He wrote extensively about German doctors who believed mental trauma could be treated through dietary interventions, and about Swiss physicians experimenting with cryptically described essence therapies. When Endecott purchased 320 acres of farmland 12 miles northeast of Carthage in the spring of 1873, locals were initially relieved. The property, a sprawling farm with a main house, several outbuildings, and a natural spring, had stood vacant since its Confederate sympathizing owners fled during the war. Endecott's plan to establish a private medical facility for treating war-related nervous disorders seemed like exactly what the region needed. He arrived with his wife Helena, a quiet woman from a prominent Boston family, and their teenage daughter, Margaret. Helena Endecott had served as a battlefield nurse during the war, and neighbors often remarked on her skill and composure in treating common ailments. Their daughter Margaret, just 18 and impressively well educated, worked alongside her father as his assistant in what he described as a small, exclusive practice for wealthy veterans who could afford experimental treatments. The facility officially opened in August of 1873, with carefully worded advertisements appearing in newspapers across Missouri, Kansas, and Arkansas. Dr. Cornelius Endecott, Harvard-trained physician and war veteran, offers revolutionary treatments for nervous disorders, melancholia, and war-related trauma at his private facility in the Missouri Hills. Discreet, comfortable accommodations, advanced European methods, correspondence invited from families seeking alternatives to conventional asylum care. The local community in Carthage watched with curiosity as well-dressed families began arriving by railroad, then continuing the journey by private carriage to the secluded facility. These were not desperate souls seeking charity. They were wealthy merchants, plantation owners, and former officers prepared to pay substantial fees for what Endecott promised would be groundbreaking treatments. One of the earliest patients was Samuel Ridgefield, a former Union captain, plagued by severe nightmares and what his family described as violent shaking fits. His brother, a successful grain merchant from Kansas City, paid Endecott a hefty $500 for a 3-month treatment program. Samuel's last letter home, dated September 15, 1873, expressed cautious optimism about Endecott's methods, though he mentioned certain treatments that seemed unusual yet scientifically plausible. After that letter, the Ridgefield family received only monthly reports meticulously written in Endecott's clinical hand, assuring them that Samuel was responding well and participating eagerly in his recovery. The first real sign that something terribly wrong was unfolding at Endecott Farm came in spring of 1874, when Martha Cunningham made an unannounced visit to check on her son, Lieutenant Thomas Cunningham, who had been a patient for 7 months. Martha, widow of a prosperous Missouri lumber merchant, had grown suspicious after her son's letters suddenly stopped arriving in February, replaced instead by formal monthly reports penned by Dr. Endecott himself. What Martha discovered that April morning would haunt her for the rest of her life, though for years few would take seriously her increasingly frantic claims. She arrived at the farm shortly after dawn, traveling from Springfield by railroad and hiring a local man to drive the final 12 miles in his wagon. The driver, a farmer named Josiah Brennan, later told authorities that Martha had been visibly anxious during the journey, frequently checking her pocket watch and urging him to hurry. Upon reaching the entrance, a simple wooden sign reading Endecott Private Medical Facility, Martha asked Brennan to wait while she conducted her visit. From the outside, the main house, a 2-story white structure with green shutters, appeared perfectly maintained. Gardens were planted in neat rows, and smoke curled from 2 chimneys, suggesting ordinary domestic life. Yet, Martha later recalled an immediate, unsettling sense of wrongness, accompanied by a strange, sweet, cloying smell that seemed to emanate from the building itself. Dr. Endecott greeted her at the front door with calm, professional courtesy. But Martha noticed that his clothing was stained apparently with blood, and despite recent washing, his hands still bore dark residue beneath his fingernails. He apologized, claiming he had been performing an emergency procedure and hadn't had time to change. His manner was composed and confident, befitting a Harvard-trained physician. Still, Martha later remembered something deeply disturbing about his eyes, a fervent intensity that reminded her of religious fanatics she had encountered during the war, an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine and made her uneasy in a way she couldn't explain. When Martha demanded to see her son immediately, Endecott calmly explained that Thomas was in a critical phase of treatment that could not be interrupted. Instead, he guided her to his office, a room lined with medical texts and anatomical charts where he presented detailed notes on Thomas's progress. The notes, written in precise medical language, described various dietary interventions and essence therapies that supposedly yielded remarkable results in treating Thomas's war-related nervous condition. Your son has embraced the most advanced treatments available anywhere in America, Endecott said, his voice brimming with the authority of medical expertise. We are seeing unprecedented success in cases like his, but the process requires complete isolation from outside influences during this critical transformation period. Martha pressed for more specifics, but Endecott deflected with technical explanations of neurological regeneration and cellular restoration through specialized nutrition. He even showed what appeared to be official correspondence from medical colleges in Boston and Philadelphia, praising his innovative work with anthropological dietary studies and their potential applications to mental health. Despite his reassurances, Martha's maternal instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong. She demanded to see the other patients or at least observe a treatment session from a distance. Endecott's refusal was polite, yet firm, citing patient confidentiality and the delicate nature of the treatments. As Martha prepared to leave, frustrated but not yet fully alarmed, she heard a sound that would change everything. From somewhere deep within the house came a human voice, raised in a way that might have been laughter or might have been screaming. The sound lasted only a few seconds before being abruptly cut off. Martha would later swear it was her son's voice, twisted by an emotion she could not name. When she asked Endecott about the sound, he explained calmly that patients sometimes experienced intense emotional releases as part of their healing process. Thomas, he assured her, was likely expressing joy at a breakthrough. His explanation was medically plausible, delivered with professional confidence. But Martha later said that something in his eyes told her he was lying. The drive back to Carthage with Josiah Brennan passed in tense silence. Martha tried to coax information from the farmer, but he admitted he rarely visited the remote area and had heard little gossip about the doctor or his patients. Almost casually, he mentioned an unusually large number of graves in the small cemetery behind the main house, far more than seemed appropriate for a medical facility that had been operating less than a year. That night, alone in her room at Carthage's only hotel, Martha wrote a long letter to her brother in St. Louis, detailing her visit and growing fears for her son's welfare. She also began a diary that would document her attempts to uncover Endecott's methods and the fate of his patients. Her entries reveal a woman torn between instinctive terror and the social pressure to trust a Harvard-educated physician. In the weeks that followed, Martha's investigation revealed a disturbing pattern. At least 6 other families had stopped receiving personal letters from loved ones at Endecott Farm, receiving only the doctor's formal monthly reports. Attempts to contact these families directly often ended in frustration. Some had moved away, others refused to discuss their experiences. The transformation of Endecott's facility from a place of supposed healing to something far more sinister had not happened overnight. In the months after Martha's visit, a pattern emerged that would horrify anyone piecing together the scattered evidence. Dr. Endecott had been methodical in his descent into madness, documenting every step with the scientific rigor he had learned at Harvard. His journal, discovered decades later in a hidden compartment behind a false wall in the farmhouse basement, revealed the twisted logic guiding his transformation from healer to predator. The entries began innocuously dating from his first weeks at the farm in 1873. Endecott wrote of his genuine desire to help veterans suffering from a new kind of war wound, psychological trauma, conventional medicine could not address. His early patients seemed to benefit from the peaceful rural setting, regular meals, and personal attention provided at the facility. Samuel Ridgefield, the former Union captain, indeed improved under Endecott's initial regimen of rest, moderate exercise, and what the doctor called rational conversation therapy. But by October 1873, the tone of Endecott's journal began to shift. He wrote increasingly about his European studies, especially time spent with a controversial German physician, Dr. Klaus Hartmann, whose theories on vital essences and biological regeneration had been rejected by mainstream medicine. Hartmann believed mental illness stemmed from deficiencies in primal nutrients only obtainable from human tissue. Endecott's first experiment with Hartmann's theories involved Samuel Ridgefield, whose improvement had plateaued after 2 months of conventional treatment. In a journal entry dated November 3rd, 1873, Endecott wrote, "Subject R continues to suffer from periodic episodes of violent trembling and night terrors. Conventional treatments have proven inadequate. I have decided to implement H's dietary protocol on an experimental basis. Subject's family has granted complete medical authority for the duration of treatment. Prepared first essence supplement this morning using tissue obtained from local mortician. Subject consumed supplement unknowingly in his evening meal. Will monitor for improvements." The local mortician Benjamin Sturz ran a modest funeral parlor in Carthage, and according to later investigations had been supplying Endecott with what he claimed were anatomical specimens for medical research. Sturz, a man deeply in debt from gambling, asked no questions about why a rural physician might need fresh human tissue, accepting Endecott's payments and explanations about advanced medical studies without hesitation. Over the following weeks, Endecott's journal recorded what he believed were remarkable improvements in Samuel Ridgefield's condition. The former captain's nightmares lessened, his trembling episodes grew less frequent, and he appeared increasingly alert and engaged during their daily sessions. Endecott credited these changes entirely to his so-called essence therapy, though any impartial observer might have noted that Samuel was likely benefiting from time rest and the focused attention of a caring physician. Emboldened by this apparent success, Endecott began incorporating human tissue into the meals of all his patients. His wife Helena, who managed the facility's kitchen, initially resisted what she considered a grotesque and dangerous practice. Yet Endecott, wielding his medical authority and pointing to Samuel's improvements, gradually convinced her that they were pioneers in a revolutionary treatment that could change medicine forever. Helena's own diary, found alongside her husband's papers decades later, reveals her internal struggle and gradual acceptance of increasingly horrific practices. In an entry dated December 1873, she wrote, "Cornelius showed me medical texts tonight that seem to support his methods. The German doctor's research appears thorough and Samuel does seem much improved. If this can help these poor men who suffered so much in the war, perhaps we are obligated to continue despite my reservations. I pray God will forgive us for what feels like sin, but maybe science." By early 1874, Endecott's supply arrangement with Stars was proving insufficient. The mortician could provide only limited tissue, and Endecott had begun to believe that fresher specimens would yield better results. His journal entries from this period reveal a man whose scientific obsession had overtaken his moral judgment. The tissue obtained from STRs shows signs of deterioration that may compromise the vital essences. Must consider fresher specimens to maximize therapeutic benefit. Dunto. The solution arrived in February 1874, when one of Endecott's patients, Lieutenant Marcus Thornburg, died suddenly in the night. Thornburg, a former Confederate officer from Arkansas whose family paid $400 per month for care, had suffered severe depression and occasionally spoke of suicide. When Helena found him dead, apparently from a heart attack, Endecott saw opportunity rather than tragedy. Instead of immediately notifying the family, Endecott performed what he called a complete anatomical examination. His journal entry for February 12, 1874 reads, "Its unexpected demise provides unprecedented opportunity to obtain optimal specimens for essence therapy. Body shows no signs of disease that would compromise therapeutic value. Extracted approximately 15 pounds of suitable tissue for processing. Informed family by telegram that T suffered heart failure and that burial took place immediately due to health concerns. They have accepted this explanation and expressed gratitude for our care during his final days." Thornburg's family would never know that their son's body, buried in the small cemetery behind the Endecott facility, was missing most of its organs and muscle tissue. They would never realize that their monthly payments had funded not his treatment, but his transformation into what Endecott had begun to regard as medicine. With access to fresh human tissue, Endecott escalated his experiments. He began serving what he called enhanced meals to all patients, meticulously monitoring reactions and recording what he considered remarkable improvements. The patients trusting their Harvard-trained physician and grateful for what appeared to be effective care ought without question. But by the summer of 1874, Endecott's appetite for experimentation had grown beyond the supply of natural deaths. He had crossed a line from which there could be no return, though he would later claim in his journals that every step was justified by scientific necessity and the promise of extraordinary therapeutic results. The catalyst for Endecott's final descent into horror came with the arrival of Jonathan Prescott, a former Union artillery officer whose wealthy Chicago family had heard of Endecott's revolutionary treatments through word of mouth from other veterans' families. Prescott suffered from violent episodes of rage alternating with periods of total withdrawal symptoms that had made him unemployable and a danger to his household. Prescott's case notes, preserved meticulously in Endecott's records, describe a man completely broken by war. At the Battle of Fredericksburg, he had watched his entire artillery battery obliterated by Confederate fire, leaving him the sole survivor among 18 men. The remainder of the war was spent in various field hospitals, suffering from what military physicians dismissed as nervous exhaustion. what modern medicine would recognize as severe combat trauma. Unlike Endecott's previous patients, Prescott proved resistant to the doctor's essence therapy. After 6 weeks of treatment, including regular doses of what Endecott now called human vital supplements, Prescott showed no improvement. In fact, his condition worsened with increasingly violent outbursts that required physical restraint. Endecott's journal entry for August 15, 1874, reveals both his frustration and his chilling decision to escalate his methods. Subject P continues to resist treatment despite optimal dosage of vital essences. Begin to suspect preserved tissue lacks sufficient potency for severe cases. Dr. Hartman's writings suggest maximum therapeutic benefit requires immediate consumption of fresh tissue from living subjects. Have resisted this approach due to practical considerations. But PE's case may require extreme measures. What Endecott was contemplating went far beyond consuming tissue from recently deceased patients. His studies of Hartman's work had convinced him that the most potent vital essences could only be obtained from living subjects, and that the psychological benefits were enhanced by the patient's participation in what Endecott began to think of as a communal act of healing. The first deliberate murder at Endecott Farm occurred on August 23, 1874. Though the doctor's clinical documentation presented it as a mercy killing both humanitarian and scientific. The victim was Samuel Ridgefield, the Union captain, who had been Endecott's first success story. By August, Samuel had been at the facility nearly a year. His initial improvements had been dramatic, but he now suffered from severe digestive issues, persistent anemia, and what Endecott described as cannibalistic cravings, begging for more of the special meals the doctor had been providing. In truth, Samuel's symptoms were likely the result of chronic malnutrition and the psychological toll of unknowingly consuming human flesh for months. But Endecott, utterly committed to his twisted theories, saw Samuel's decline as proof that he needed fresh rather than preserved tissue. Endecott's journal records the killing with clinical detachment. Subject R has reached terminal stage of vital essence deficiency despite months of treatment. Condition has become painful and dignity-destroying. Have decided to provide merciful release while simultaneously obtaining fresh specimens for treatment of Subject P. Administered fatal dose of morphine at 11:30 p.m. Death occurred peacefully at 11:47 p.m. Immediately began extraction procedures to maximize therapeutic potential of specimens. Helena Endecott's diary reveals her horror and entrapment of what Cornelius did to poor Samuel was murder, whatever he calls it. But I have helped prepare those horrible meals for so many months now. What does that make me? I cannot leave Margaret here alone with him, but I cannot see how to escape what we have become. God help us all. Samuel Ridgefield's death was reported to his family as a sudden heart attack, and his body was buried quickly in the farm's growing cemetery. Yet portions of his organs and muscle tissue were carefully processed in Endecott's makeshift laboratory, a converted root cellar beneath the main house equipped with surgical tables, preservation equipment, and detailed anatomical charts. Jonathan Prescott received his first meal containing fresh human tissue on August 25, 1874. Endecott's records describe immediate and, from his perspective, miraculous results. Prescott's violent episodes ceased almost overnight, replaced by what the doctor called profound calm and unusual mental clarity. Within a week, Prescott was participating eagerly in what Endecott described as therapeutic discussions about healing and the necessity of sacrifice. But Prescott's transformation was not recovery. It was the psychological collapse of a man who had realized on some level what was happening and had chosen madness over the unbearable reality. The letters he wrote home, encouraged by Endecott as part of therapy, took on increasingly strange and unsettling tones that should have alarmed his family, but which they misinterpreted as signs of improvement. The treatments here are unlike anything I could have imagined, Prescott wrote to his brother in September 1874. Dr. Endecott has shown me truths about healing that go beyond conventional medicine. I feel as though I am becoming someone entirely new, someone who understands the deeper connections between all living things. I no longer have nightmares about the war because I understand now that death and life are part of the same essential process. As autumn arrived, Endecott's secluded facility housed 8 patients, all of whom were unknowingly consuming human flesh in their daily meals. They also participated in what Endecott had begun to call communion meals, where special preparations were shared, supposedly containing the most potent healing essences. Yet across Missouri, Martha Cunningham had not forgotten her son Thomas or the disturbing sounds she had heard during her April visit. Throughout the summer and early fall, she continued her investigation, corresponding with other families who had relatives at the facility. Her suspicion that something terrible was happening at Endecott Farm deepened with every letter. Her breakthrough came in October 1874 when she received a letter from Virginia Prescott, Jonathan's sister. Virginia shared Martha's concerns about the strange tone of her brother's recent correspondence. The two women began comparing notes on their experiences with Dr. Endecott, and what they discovered filled them both with dread. By October, Martha Cunningham and Virginia Prescott had uncovered a pattern too chilling to ignore evidence that Endecott's facility was harboring a secret far darker than mere medical malpractice. Their correspondence, preserved in Virginia's family papers, shows 2 intelligent women painstakingly piecing together evidence that would have tested the sanity of anyone confronting it. Martha had spent months tracking down families who had sent relatives to Endecott Farm. What she discovered was disturbingly consistent. Initial letters from patients were normal, expressing gratitude and optimism about their care. But after roughly 3 months, personal letters stopped, replaced by formal reports from Endecott himself. Families pressing for more information were told their loved ones had entered advanced treatment phases that required complete isolation from outside influences. Virginia's investigation focused on financial records, and what she found was equally troubling. Families were continuing to pay substantial monthly fees long after personal correspondence had ceased, often extending far beyond the originally agreed treatment periods. Some had been paying for more than 18 months, receiving only occasional assurances that their relatives were responding well and participating enthusiastically in advanced therapeutic protocols. The 2 women's most chilling discovery came when they cross-referenced the names of patients whose families had lost contact. Comparing newspaper obituaries and local funeral records, they found that at least 12 men who had been patients at Endecott Farm were buried across Missouri, Arkansas, and Kansas. Yet their families had never been notified of their deaths. And still, Endecott continued to accept payments, sending reports claiming their loved ones were alive and improving. Martha's diary entry for October 18, 1874, captures her growing horror. Virginia has confirmed what I feared most, that at least some of the men we've been paying to treat are already dead and buried. But if Thomas and the others are dead, who is Dr. Endecott treating? And why does he continue to accept payment for caring for corpses? There is some deception here so monstrous that I can barely allow myself to consider its true nature. Determined to uncover the truth, Martha resolved to return to Endecott Farm, but this time prepared and with witnesses. She recruited her brother-in-law, Judge William Cunningham, a respected circuit court judge from Springfield, and Sheriff Deputy Robert Hayes, who agreed to accompany them on what Martha described as a welfare check for her son. The second visit to Endecott Farm took place on October 25, 1874, and it would finally expose the full horror of what Dr. Cornelius Endecott had constructed in the remote Missouri hills. Martha Cunningham, Judge William Cunningham, and Deputy Robert Hayes arrived just after noon, traveling in the judge's official carriage, making no attempt to hide their authority. From the moment they approached the main house, a sense of fundamental wrongness gripped them. From a distance, the building appeared well-maintained, but up-close windows were shrouded in heavy curtains, preventing any view of the interior. The sickly sweet cloying smell that Martha remembered from her first visit had intensified, hanging in the air around the entire property, like a forewarning of what lay within. Dr. Endecott greeted them at the front door. With the same professional courtesy he had shown Martha 6 months earlier. Yet Judge Cunningham immediately noticed changes in the man: weight loss, restless energy, and eyes that combined the fervor of a religious zealot with the calculating cunning of a confidence man. When the judge announced that they were conducting an official welfare check on Thomas Cunningham and requested immediate access to all patients, Endecott's calm demeanor cracked. His polite objections became barely controlled agitation. He insisted that such a visit would violate patient confidentiality and disrupt months of delicate therapeutic progress. I'm afraid you don't understand the revolutionary nature of the treatments here. Endecott told them, a desperate edge beneath his professional tone. These men have been broken by war in ways conventional medicine cannot address. Our methods are showing unprecedented success, but they require complete commitment from both patient and practitioner. Outside interference could prove catastrophically damaging. Judge Cunningham, a man not easily swayed by authority, especially one that seemed designed to hide the truth, reminded Endecott of his legal power to inspect any medical facility in his jurisdiction when patient welfare was in question. What came next would be burned into the memories of all three visitors. As they entered the house, the smell that had hovered outside now overwhelmed them, a nauseating mix of medicinal alcohol decay and something else that Martha later likened to a butcher shop. The interior, which should have resembled a medical office or boarding house, felt like a stage set designed to conceal darker realities. Endecott first guided them to his office, presenting files documenting the remarkable progress of his patients. But when Judge Cunningham pressed to see the patients themselves, Endecott's explanations grew frantic and contradictory. Some, he claimed, were sleeping due to medication schedules. Others were supposedly outside on remote therapy sessions. Still more were in critical phases of treatment that could not be interrupted. Deputy Hayes, silent until now, finally spoke. "Doctor, when a man has nothing to hide, he shows everything willingly. Your reluctance suggests you have something to conceal." It was then that the sound came, a human voice, muffled yet unmistakably screaming, echoing from somewhere beneath their feet. It lasted only seconds before abruptly ending. But it was enough to galvanize Hayes into action. That scream came from below us. Hayes announced, drawing his service revolver. "Dr. Endecott, I am placing you under arrest pending investigation. Judge Cunningham, I recommend we search this building immediately and thoroughly." What they found in the basement of the Endecott farmhouse would be documented in court records sealed for more than 70 years. The laboratory below revealed a horror so methodical and complete that even seasoned law enforcement struggled to comprehend its full scope. Dr. Cornelius Endecott had not simply created a place of murder. He had built a systematic operation, a macabre enterprise that had transformed human beings into what he sincerely believed was medicine, a grotesque vision of healing gone catastrophically, unimaginably wrong. The converted root cellar beneath the Endecott farmhouse had been divided into several rooms, each serving a grotesque purpose in Dr. Cornelius Endecott's nightmarish vision of healing. The first room contained 2 surgical tables fitted with restraints, surrounded by medical instruments that gleamed as if recently used. Anatomical charts covered the walls, but these were no ordinary illustrations. Hand-drawn diagrams detailed which parts of the human body contained what Endecott called optimal vital essences, alongside meticulous instructions for extracting them from living subjects. Judge Cunningham's official report, unsealed only in 1947, recorded the scene with chilling precision. Bloodstains marred the floor, human hair and tissue fragments littered the tables, and glass containers held preserved organs. Each was labeled with patient initials and dates, suggesting a methodical system for harvesting and processing human remains for consumption. The second room served as Endecott's processing laboratory. Here, grinding equipment, preservation chemicals, and cooking apparatus had been used to transform human tissue into what appeared at first glance to be ordinary food products. Recipe books detailed methods for disguising the taste and texture of human flesh, with instructions for stews, roasts, and preserves that could be stored for weeks. But it was the third room that revealed the full psychological horror. Here, 3 men, once patients, had been transformed into something almost unrecognizable as human. Among them were Thomas Cunningham and Jonathan Prescott. They were alive, but the experience had shattered their minds, leaving them hollowed and unnervingly compliant. Martha Cunningham's diary, written weeks later after she had processed what she had witnessed, captures the indescribable horror. Thomas was alive, but the son I had raised and loved was gone. The thing that wore his face looked at me with recognition, but also with hunger. When I tried to embrace him, he pulled away and asked in a voice I barely recognized whether I had brought him anything to eat. When I asked what he meant, he said he hoped I might have brought some of the good food Dr. Endecott served. I realized with horror that my son had been trained to crave human flesh, and he no longer understood why this should disturb anyone. Endecott's journals from the final weeks of his operation reveal a man completely convinced he was conducting legitimate medical research. In an entry dated October 20th, 1874, just 5 days before his arrest, he wrote, "Subjects C, P, and M continue to show remarkable improvement under the enhanced dietary protocol. Their war-related traumas have been completely resolved, replaced by what I can only describe as perfect mental clarity and acceptance of natural biological processes. They understand now that healing requires participation in the fundamental cycles of consumption and renewal that govern all life. Investigators discovered that Endecott had selected patients not only for their war trauma, but for their isolation and family distance, as well as the willingness of relatives to pay extended fees without frequent contact. Men estranged from families or living far from Missouri became ideal candidates for what he called his complete treatment protocol. Helena Endecott was found in the main house kitchen, still preparing what her husband's journals called communion meals, elaborate dinners that incorporated human tissue into every dish served to patients as part of their so-called therapeutic ritual. Deputy Hayes noted that Helena's mental state was one of total dissociation, suggesting she had suffered a psychological break from the horrors she had helped perpetuate. Even now, reading the reports and diaries, one cannot help but shiver, imagining the scene, the transformation of a home, a family, and men, broken by war into instruments of an unthinkable cruelty. Margaret Endecott, the doctor's daughter, had been living within this nightmare for over a year, assisting with meal preparation and medical procedures she had been taught to view as revolutionary therapies. Weeks later, under extensive psychological evaluation, her testimony revealed how deeply she had been indoctrinated. Though she had never fully comprehended the full horror of her father's work, investigators gradually pieced together the scope of the Endecott operation. Over 18 months at least, 23 men had been admitted as patients. 17 had died, their bodies processed for consumption, their deaths hidden from families who continued paying hefty monthly fees. The remaining 6 had been psychologically transformed into willing participants in what Endecott called therapeutic anthropophagy. These men, once broken by war, now depended entirely on their captor and accepted practices that would have horrified them in previous lives. Perhaps the most chilling revelation was Endecott's correspondence with other physicians. Letters from doctors in Kansas, Arkansas, and Illinois requested details of his dietary protocols. While no evidence showed that these physicians implemented his methods, it suggested that Endecott's influence might have reached far beyond his isolated Missouri facility. When Deputy Hayes placed Endecott under arrest, the doctor's reaction revealed the depth of his delusion. "You're making a terrible mistake," he told the officer with sincere conviction. "These men have been cured of ailments no conventional physician could treat. What you call criminal history will recognize as the foundation of a new medical science. I have documentation from European colleagues to verify my methods." Even surrounded by irrefutable evidence of his crimes, Endecott remained convinced that he was a medical pioneer. His journals contained detailed plans for expanding his operation, including letters to potential investors for additional facilities across the Midwest, where what he called therapeutic consumption would revolutionize mental health treatment. The arrest sent shockwaves through the medical community, not just in Missouri, but across the United States. Here was a Harvard-trained physician, a decorated war veteran, whose meticulous methods had turned a legitimate medical facility into a house of horrors that tested the very limits of human morality and medical ethics. The aftermath forced the nation to ask uncomfortable questions. How were veterans truly being cared for? How rigorously was medical authority regulated? And how far might desperate families unknowingly go in the search for healing? The ensuing legal proceedings were conducted with unprecedented secrecy. Judge Cunningham recused himself due to personal involvement, and the case was transferred to federal jurisdiction to prevent public panic. The trial was held in a closed courtroom in St. Louis with strict orders forbidding press coverage. Endecott's defense revealed the extent of his delusional rationalization. His attorney, Harrison Fletcher, planned to argue insanity, but Endecott refused, insisting on presenting medical evidence to defend his work. Over 3 days of testimony, he spoke with the confidence of a legitimate researcher, citing German medical texts, European case studies, and meticulously kept records showing what he claimed were remarkable improvements in patient conditions. Several medical professionals present later admitted to feeling momentarily convinced of the scientific merit behind his arguments. Gentlemen of the jury, Endecott declared during his final statement, "You are asked to condemn practices you do not understand, based on moral prejudices with no foundation in medical science. These men came to me, broken by war, destroyed by experiences conventional medicine could not address. I gave them peace, clarity, and purpose. Examine their mental states before and after treatment. You will see a transformation that speaks for itself." Even today, reading his statements, it's almost possible to feel the chilling conviction in his voice, the terrifying certainty of a man whose morality had been consumed by his obsession. And as we reflect on these events, it's worth asking yourself, could desperation for healing ever lead us to trust the unthinkable? The prosecution's case relied heavily on the testimonies of the surviving patients, though even these accounts posed chilling challenges. Thomas Cunningham, Jonathan Prescott, and Marcus Webb had been so profoundly altered that preparing them for courtroom appearances required careful handling. Their very presence was a haunting testament to Endecott's manipulations. Thomas's testimony was perhaps the most unsettling. Speaking in a calm, measured tone, eerily devoid of the emotion his mother had expected, he described his ordeal at Endecott Farm as the most meaningful experience of my life. He explained that Dr. Endecott had helped him understand the connections between healing and sacrifice, that his war trauma had been completely resolved through what he called participation in the essential processes of renewal. When prosecutors pressed about the meals served at the facility, Thomas displayed no distress, no revulsion. Instead, he said quietly, "Dr. Endecott explained that true healing requires us to accept nourishment from those who have completed their own healing journeys. It was an honor to receive such treatment, and I felt grateful to contribute to the healing of others when my time came." Psychiatrists who examined the survivors were equally unnerved. Dr. Augustus Peyton, brought in from Chicago, concluded that the men had undergone systematic psychological reconstruction that had permanently altered their sense of morality, identity, and human relationships. "These men have not merely been traumatized," he wrote, "they have been methodically reprogrammed to accept and even embrace practices that would normally provoke the strongest revulsion. Isolation dependency and gradual introduction of taboo behaviors, framed as medical treatment, created a form of psychological slavery more complete than anything I have encountered in my professional experience." Helena Endecott's testimony offered insight into how an otherwise normal family could be drawn into such horror. By this point, her mental state had deteriorated significantly. She recounted with tears how her husband had slowly persuaded her that they were pioneering revolutionary medical treatments. "He showed me medical books and correspondence with other doctors," she sobbed. "He explained everything in scientific terms I didn't fully understand, but it sounded legitimate. When I expressed doubts, he reminded me that Samuel seemed so much better and that we were helping men who had suffered so much during the war. I knew it felt wrong, but I believed Cornelius when he said we were saving lives. Margaret Endecott, now 19 and profoundly traumatized, gave perhaps the most chilling testimony. She described helping prepare meals containing human tissue, assisting with medical procedures that were actually torture and murder, and participating in so-called therapeutic discussions where patients were gradually indoctrinated into accepting cannibalism as healing. Father made everything seem normal and necessary, she said. He taught me that conventional morality was just prejudice that prevented people from accepting advanced medical treatments. I believed him because he was my father, because he was a doctor, and because the patients seemed grateful for what we were doing. I thought we were heroes. The trial's most dramatic moment came when prosecutors presented Endecott's detailed journals, reading passages that chronicled his meticulous transformation from a legitimate physician into a systematic predator. The entries revealed a man, methodical, calculating, and utterly convinced of the righteousness of his actions. One entry dated March 1874 was particularly damning, exposing the precise logic Endecott used to justify murder as medicine. Dr. Endecott's own words read aloud during the trial revealed the full depth of his delusion. The conventional medical establishment's horror at anthropophagic therapies stems from ignorance and moral prejudice rather than scientific understanding. History will vindicate these methods when physicians finally accept that true healing requires participation in fundamental biological processes that civilized society has arbitrarily forbidden. The men under my care understand this truth and embrace it willingly. Despite his fervent defense, justice was served. Dr. Cornelius Endecott was convicted on 17 counts of murder and sentenced to death, though his sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment after questions about his mental state. Helena Endecott was convicted as an accessory to murder and sentenced to 20 years, serving 12 before dying of consumption in the Missouri State Penitentiary. Margaret Endecott, the daughter, whose life had been irreparably shaped by her father's madness, was placed in the care of relatives in Massachusetts, legally changed her name, and vanished from historical records after 1878. The surviving patients presented a unique challenge for the legal system. While undeniably victims, their psychological transformation was so complete that traditional rehabilitation was impossible. Thomas Cunningham lived in a private asylum in Illinois until 1923, never regaining his former personality and continuing to request what he called proper food until his death. Jonathan Prescott spent his remaining years institutionalized in Chicago, writing letters to medical journals that praised the treatments he had received, urging doctors to study Endecott's methods. Marcus Webb returned to his family in Kentucky, but never reintegrated into normal life and ultimately took his own life in 1881. The Endecott case sent shockwaves far beyond the immediate horrors of the Missouri hills. It exposed dangerous gaps in medical regulation, revealed the vulnerability of traumatized veterans to exploitation, and forced society to confront uncomfortable questions about trust, authority, and desperation. In response, medical licensing boards across the United States enacted new regulations requiring ongoing supervision of private facilities and regular inspections of treatment centers. Skepticism of experimental treatments grew, and an emphasis on domestically trained physicians and ethically sound practices became more pronounced. The case also left an indelible mark on psychiatric science. Dr. Augustus Peyton's meticulous reports on Endecott's psychological manipulation became foundational in the study of brainwashing coercion and trauma treatment. Simultaneously, the case highlighted inadequacies in veterans' care, spurring the development of more systematic approaches to treating psychological injuries caused by war. Perhaps the most disturbing legacy, however, was the revelation that Endecott's influence had extended beyond his own facility. Investigators uncovered correspondence between Endecott and at least 12 other physicians across 6 states, all expressing interest in his dietary protocols. While no evidence suggested these doctors had practiced cannibalism, the letters revealed a disturbing openness within the medical community to treatments that pushed ethical boundaries. One letter from Dr. William Hartwell in Kansas stood out. "Your reports on anthropohagic therapy are fascinating and suggest possibilities that conventional medicine has been too prejudiced to explore. I have several patients here who might benefit from such innovative approaches. Could you provide more detailed protocols for implementation?" Federal authorities quietly investigated these correspondences, uncovering at least 3 other facilities where patients had vanished under suspicious circumstances. Though definitive links to cannibalistic practices were never established, the investigations exposed a pattern of experimental treatments that exploited vulnerable patients and defied moral and ethical norms. In the end, the Endecott case became more than a tale of unspeakable crime. It became a cautionary story about the intersection of authority, desperation, and human vulnerability, a grim reminder of how science unchecked by ethics can become a tool of unimaginable horror. The Endecott farmhouse itself was burned to the ground in 1877, 2 years after Cornelius Endecott's conviction in what officials described as a public health measure. Local residents, many still haunted by what had occurred, they refused to approach the property. Several families abandoned the area, entirely claiming that the land itself had been tainted by the horrors that had unfolded within the walls. The small cemetery behind the house, which contained the remains of Endecott's victims, was relocated to Carthage's municipal cemetery. At the request of surviving family members, the graves were left unmarked, a silent memorial to lives lost and truths too dark to be publicly acknowledged. Martha Cunningham spent the remainder of her life advocating for oversight of medical facilities and support for families of war-traumatized veterans. She established a fund to assist those seeking treatment for relatives suffering from the psychological scars of battle, and she worked tirelessly with state legislators to strengthen laws governing private medical practice. Her diary, published posthumously in 1923, became an invaluable historical record, offering both a first-hand account of the Endecott case and insight into the broader struggles faced by Civil War veterans' families. The case continued to resonate across decades. Police departments developed new investigative protocols for medical facilities, and medical schools began incorporating ethics courses, often using the Endecott case as a chilling example of how professional authority could be corrupted by obsession and pseudoscience. In 1925, 50 years after the discovery of Endecott Farm, a research team from the University of Missouri attempted to locate and exhume the graves for forensic study. But the burial sites had been deliberately obscured, and local residents, many descendants of those who had lived through the events, refused to cooperate. The community seemed determined to let the dead rest, leaving the horrors buried in memory as much as in soil. The story of Dr. Cornelius Endecott remains a stark reminder of the dangers inherent in unchecked authority, desperation, and pseudoscience. What made this case particularly harrowing was not only the nature of the crimes, but the systematic way Endecott convinced himself, his family, and even his patients that cannibalism could be transformed into medicine, validated by scientific methodology and the aura of medical authority. When the case files were finally unsealed in 1947, they revealed that Endecott's operation had been far more sophisticated and extensive than the original investigators could have imagined. His influence on his victims and family was devastatingly complete and enduring. Perhaps most unsettling was evidence of regular correspondence with European physicians who claimed to be conducting similar research. Whether these letters represented legitimate science or an international network of medical criminals was never fully determined, but the implication that such thinking could cross borders added a chilling dimension to the story. Endecott's techniques of psychological manipulation, gradual indoctrination, creating dependency, and exploiting authority later became foundational studies for psychiatrists and criminologists. These methods foreshadowed the tactics of totalitarian regimes and cult leaders, demonstrating how human psychology can be systematically reshaped under conditions of control and isolation. The 3 surviving patients never fully recovered, living the rest of their lives as testaments to the completeness of Endecott's psychological manipulation. Their cases contributed to early understandings of Stockholm Syndrome and trauma bonding, showing how deeply an individual can be conditioned to accept, even embrace, unspeakable acts. Though the medical community of the 1870s lacked the framework to comprehend what had been done, the Endecott case ultimately shaped the development of medical ethics as a formal discipline, ensuring that the lessons of horror would endure far beyond the Missouri hills. The shocking revelation that a Harvard-trained physician could so systematically abuse his authority led to profound changes in American medicine. New requirements for medical education, ongoing supervision of practitioners, and formal ethical guidelines became cornerstones of practice rules that still protect patients today. In many ways, the Endecott case anticipated the ethical debates of the 20th century, exposing the dangers of unchecked experimentation, long before research ethics became a formal discipline. Endecott's unwavering conviction that he was conducting legitimate science despite the absence of controls, peer review, or moral oversight would foreshadow later medical scandals involving unauthorized human experimentation. The fate of his surviving family members remained shrouded in mystery for decades. Margaret Endecott, under her new identity, disappeared from historical records, though census documents hint that she may have married and lived quietly in New England. Helena Endecott died in prison, leaving behind a detailed confession that shed light on how her husband had gradually drawn her into complicity. The burned remains of Endecott Farm were eventually purchased by the state of Missouri and incorporated into a state forest, ensuring the land would never again be used for private development. Park rangers would later report that visitors often felt a vague unease or disturbance. Though whether this was psychological or something more unsettling remained unclear. The medical instruments discovered in Endecott's basement laboratory were destroyed by court order, but photographs and detailed descriptions survived, preserved in law enforcement archives. These documents became crucial for understanding both 19th century medical practice and the ways medical criminals could disguise torture as treatment. Cornelius Endecott died in the Missouri State Penitentiary in 1889, 14 years after his conviction. Records indicate he never expressed remorse, continuing until his death to insist that his methods represented suppressed medical breakthroughs. According to the prison chaplain, his final request was that his journals be preserved for future researchers who might vindicate his work. The Endecott case remains one of the most chilling examples of medical criminality in American history, not only for the acts themselves, but for the terrifying combination of authority, desperation, and self-deception that made such horror possible. Endecott's unshakable belief in the righteousness of his actions reminds us that the greatest danger often comes not from those who know they do evil, but from those who are convinced their evil serves a higher purpose. Even today, more than 150 years later, the case serves as a cautionary tale. It warns of the vulnerability of desperate people, the necessity of ethical oversight, and the horrifying consequences when trust is abused. The 17 men who died and the 3 who survived but were forever changed stand as silent witnesses to how swiftly the promise of healing can transform into unspeakable horror. What do you think of this story? Was everything about Dr. Endecott's operation revealed, or could darker secrets still lie buried somewhere in the Missouri hills? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this tale disturbing and compelling, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who loves history's darkest mysteries. The past holds many secrets, and some are more terrifying than anything fiction could imagine. Join me next time as we uncover another dark truth history tried to forget.